10 years ago, my home was the driver's seat of a beat-up sedan. I was 23 years old, completely broke, unemployed, and utterly terrified of what tomorrow would bring. When I looked my own parents in the eye and begged for a lifeline, they coldly told me that I needed to figure it out on my own. But then my aunt stepped in, opened her front door, and handed me a pillow and a blanket for her cold, unfinished basement. Just last week, my parents sat across a crowded room in absolute silence, forced to watch me hand that very same aunt the keys to a brand new house. For the first time in their lives, they finally realized the immense value of what they had so carelessly thrown away. The lowest point of my entire existence began with a sudden, devastating phone call from my landlord. I was 3 months behind on rent. My excuses had completely run out, and no more extensions were being granted. By the time the sun went down that evening, every single thing I owned in this world was packed tightly into the back of my car. Desperate for a miracle, I drove straight to my parents' house because I foolishly believed that is what families do when things go wrong. I sat at their kitchen table, tears streaming down my face, openly weeping as I pleaded for temporary shelter. My mother, Linda, just offered a heavy sigh that sounded far more annoyed than sympathetic, showing her true colors immediately. Instead of offering comfort, she casually reminded me of my age as if turning 23 magically guarantees financial stability. I stared at her in utter disbelief, holding my breath and waiting for some shred of parental instinct to kick in, but the help never arrived. My father, Carl, simply nodded his head in agreement and stated that perhaps this crisis would finally teach me a lesson about real-world responsibility. It was deeply disturbing how they could look at their own child-facing homelessness and treat it like a tough love motivational seminar. That icy reaction was my first real warning sign of how conditional their love truly was. Before I could even process their cruelty, my older brother Ethan strolled into the kitchen. He was the undisputed golden child of the family, the future business tycoon, and could absolutely do no wrong in their eyes. He took one look out the window at my packed car, let out a loud laugh, and joked that adulthood had finally caught up with me. The most heartbreaking part was watching my mother laugh right along with him at my expense. I was not asking them for a massive loan, but simply a safe couch to sleep on for a few weeks to get back on my feet. My father just shook his head and claimed they had absolutely no room, which was a blatant lie, considering their massive house had 3 completely empty bedrooms. Within 20 minutes, I was forced back into my car, shaking uncontrollably and crying from the overwhelming humiliation of being rejected by my own flesh and blood. As I sat there in the dark, my phone suddenly lit up with an unfamiliar number that I almost completely ignored. Thank God I answered it, because that single decision altered the entire trajectory of my life. A gentle voice on the other end called out my name, and I realized it was my Aunt Rachel, my father's younger sister whom I had not spoken to in months. She softly told me she had heard exactly what happened at the house and told me to drive over to her place immediately. Rachel lived about 40 minutes away in a modest, working-class neighborhood that was a far cry from my parents' wealthy suburb. She was already standing on her porch, holding a thick winter blanket before my car even came to a complete stop in her driveway. She guided me inside, mentioning that the lower level got quite chilly at night, and the sheer contrast of her instant kindness made me burst into tears. The basement was completely unfinished with cold concrete floors, old metal storage shelves, and a noisy water heater hummed in the corner. There was nothing down there but a single canvas camping cot. Yet to me, that tiny cot felt like a grand palace because somebody had actually chosen to shelter me. The very next morning, Aunt Rachel was waiting for me at her kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee, some toast, and a blank legal pad. She looked directly at me and calmly stated that I would be staying with her for as long as it took to get my life stable. There were no hidden conditions, no agonizing lectures, and absolutely zero attempts to humiliate me for my failures. Rachel worked long night shifts at a local medical billing company, which was exhausting work, but she seemed to know everyone in town. By the time lunch rolled around, she had already printed out dozens of job listings, highlighting the best options and adding personal contact notes for me. While my parents had only offered useless criticism, Rachel was actively providing real, tangible solutions to my problems. Later that afternoon, a text message from my brother popped up on my phone, filled with a vague sense of superiority as he hoped I was figuring things out. There was no genuine concern, no inquiry about where I was sleeping, and no offer to help. My father even chimed in via text to reiterate that his tough love philosophy always works. Out for the best in the end. I stared at the screen in disbelief, realizing my painful homelessness was just a proud family theory to them. Against all odds, I managed to land an interview for an entry-level office assistant position. Just 3 days later, I was so consumed by anxiety that I almost skipped the appointment entirely. But Rachel practically pushed me out the front door with a smile. She looked at me and said that I did not need confidence right now. I just needed to build momentum. That brilliant piece of advice stuck with me for the next decade of my career. Every single night, Rachel would quietly check on me in the basement, never making a dramatic scene, but always ensuring I felt supported. She eventually handed me a small notebook and told me to start writing down my daily goals, because she knew hopeless people stop planning for the future. 2 weeks into my new routine, my mother called me completely out of the blue, and answering it turned out to be a massive mistake. She did not bother to ask about my job search or see if I had a roof over my head. Instead, she coldly warned me not to get too comfortable staying at my aunt's house, as if my basic survival was somehow an inconvenience to her. To shake off the negativity, Rachel treated me to a quiet Sunday dinner of pasta and cheap wine. Halfway through the meal, she admitted that my father had called her the exact day she took me in, which shocked me because he never reached out on my behalf. Rachel let out a dark, disappointed laugh and revealed that my father had actually called to demand that she not enable my bad behavior. I froze in my seat as the harsh reality sunk in. He was actively trying to prevent anyone from helping his own child. Rachel leaned back in her chair and sadly explained that my father resented her because she was the only person in the family who refused to agree with his toxic behavior. In that moment, the complex dynamics of my family finally made sense, and I realized Rachel was an outsider just like me. 3 weeks later, I officially got the job, and when I rushed home to share the news, Rachel hugged me so tightly that she started crying tears of pure joy. 6 months down the road, my hard work paid off and I received a modest promotion that allowed me to finally start saving money. I was completely thrilled to celebrate, and Rachel went out of her way to bake a beautiful cake to mark the occasion. Out of nowhere, my parents unexpectedly showed up at the house, acting incredibly proud and pretending like they had been supporting me all along. Within 10 minutes of sitting down, my father's tone shifted as he brought up my brother Ethan, who was apparently trying to launch a new business venture. It became instantly clear that their sudden visit had absolutely nothing to do with checking on my well-being. My mother smiled nervously and asked if I would be willing to contribute a significant portion of my savings to help fund Ethan's new startup. I could barely contain my anger at the absolute audacity of people who had denied me a couch, now asking me for investment capital. Right on cue, Rachel walked into the kitchen, assessed the tense situation in a single glance, and boldly asked exactly how much money they were demanding. My father stood up abruptly, visibly embarrassed, and snapped that this was strictly private family business. It was deeply ironic how my homelessness was never considered family business, but my brother's financial needs certainly were. Ethan confidently blurted out that they needed $25,000, which caused me to nearly choke on my drink. I looked around the room and noticed that nobody felt a single shred of shame except for Aunt Rachel, who looked disgusted. I looked my parents dead in the eye, smiled politely, and uttered a single, powerful word, no. The entire room completely froze because they were entirely unprepared for me to stand up for myself. My mother immediately became emotional and defensively claimed that they had helped me in the past, which was a delusion that made the situation even worse. After my parents stormed out of the house, Rachel sat in deep thought before revealing that there was still a major secret she had kept from me. She confessed that my father had visited her house in person shortly after I moved into the basement. He had aggressively pressured her to kick me out onto the street. Firmly believing that suffering was the only way I would learn a lesson, A lifetime of extreme favoritism suddenly snapped into sharp focus as Rachel reached into an old drawer and handed me a manila folder. Inside was a photocopy of a $40,000 check that my father had signed over to Ethan the exact same month I was left homeless. The devastating evidence proved that my parents absolutely had the financial means to help. They simply chose to completely abandon me. Rachel then handed me several more pages documenting a long history of paying off Ethan's massive credit card debts and failed business expenses. She then dropped another bombshell, revealing that the beautiful home my parents lived in was actually purchased with money from my grandparents. To cap it all off, she handed me an old, yellowed letter written in my late grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. I carefully read the single sentence inside, which stated that Rachel always takes care of the people whom the rest of the family chooses to overlook. 10 long years passed by, and my professional career absolutely skyrocketed as I built my own successful company and achieved true financial freedom. I eventually organized a massive family gathering at a high-end restaurant, inviting everyone, including my parents and Ethan, who had no idea what was actually happening. Rachel arrived last, wearing a simple dress and offering the same warm smile she had possessed when I was at my lowest point. Halfway through the dinner, Ethan stood up to make a pompous speech, raising a glass to toast my success while subtly insulting my past. My mother chimed in to claim they always knew I would figure it out, which was a blatant lie. I remained completely calm, stood up from the table, and walked over to hand Rachel a small, elegant wooden box tied with a silver ribbon. She laughed nervously as she opened it, only to find a single shiny key resting inside on a velvet cushion. The entire room fell into a dead silence as I looked at her and proudly announced that the beautiful new house downtown was officially hers. Rachel immediately burst into tears of pure disbelief, while my parents and Ethan sat, completely stunned and paralyzed with embarrassment. I looked around the table and made it clear to everyone that the only reason I survived to achieve this success was because Rachel refused to let me fail. My father stared down at his plate for a long time before quietly whispering that they had made some terrible mistakes in the past. There were no more excuses left for them to make as they were forced to witness the direct consequences of their selfishness in real time. After the dinner concluded, Rachel and I stood outside together beneath the evening sky, looking down at the keys in her trembling hands. She softly asked me why I had done something so incredibly generous for her. I smiled warmly and told her the absolute truth, because 10 years ago, when I had absolutely nothing, she was the only person who treated me like I was actually worth something.